Well, hi again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of 100 Yards of Football. This is where we look at some of the great players of the past and bring them to your light here today, even though their careers, their legacy is way back in the past. But we want just a little bit for you. And today we're going to talk about one of the special players of all time. Before we do, let's give thanks to Jeremiah Long, our producer and engineer. And along with me is Vincent Turner. Vincent, the co-host and founder of 100 Yards of Football. And today, Vincent, we get to talk about one Robert Lawrence Layne.
Outstanding football player, man. When you talk about fiery, a guy that spoke his mind, a lot of great stories about him when he was with the Detroit Lions. But what I came to know about him, his career at Texas, he was one of the best all-time athletes ever that went through that school. Hell of a baseball pitcher this time at the University of Texas. Back to you, Harper.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because I do have a question about that regarding his early life. But Bobby Layne was born on December 19th, 1926 in the small town of Santa Ana, Texas, somewhere in the middle of Texas, in this tiny little area that even today there's only a little more than 1,000 people that live there. But to say he was a country boy wouldn't be a misstatement at all. But Bobby had a lot of tragedy in his life, and one of the early portions of that was losing his father when he was just 8 years old. Bobby's dad was 36 when he passed away, and his mother, Bee, had a lot of trouble because this is early in the Great Depression, and for her to try to keep her family together and keep everybody fed and have a roof underneath them was not an easy task for her. So Bobby ends up being sent off to an aunt and an uncle, and they take care of him for a little while, and they finally adopt him and move to Highland, Texas. Highland Park High School is where he went, but just outside of the Dallas area. And that proved to be a relationship that changed him in many ways. Athletically, he could do just about anything. He was a great thrower. Vincent, as you mentioned, he was a pitcher. He ran track. He could play basketball. But there at Highland Park High School, football is really where he made a name for himself. They went 26-2-2 in the 3 years that he was a part of the Highland football program. And as you mentioned, he was a heck of a baseball player. But I don't see anywhere, there's no record of him playing baseball at the high school level. So we're not saying it didn't happen, but it doesn't make sense for him to be as good as he was in college without him having some prior, foothold in the early days. His farm system would have been in Little League or possibly at the high school level, but I don't have any records of that, Vincent. I'm unable to do that. But he played well enough to where he was recruited to play baseball, but he also looked at football, and Clemson was one of many schools that was interested in him, but he ends up picking up and taking his talents to Austin from the Dallas area, and what a difference he made for the Texas Longhorns.
When you look at his career, as you just mentioned, baseball and no records up in high school. So it's kind of amazing what he did as far as the baseball pitch, and then also on the football field. Baseball, he went 60-10 as a pitcher, 28-0 in the Southwest Conference. Then he went to 3 bowl games while he was a quarterback at the University of Texas. But what made me really get excited about Bobby Layne, he set the tone for Highland Park High School. Matthew Stafford, his teammate in the late 40s, Doak Walker, Clayton Kershaw, all those great athletes that came out of Highland Park, and then he goes to Texas. And one thing that I seen enjoyable about him, he was a winner, leadership, and a guy that played the game, both baseball and football, at another level, but make no bones about it. He was the guy that if something need to be made, a play, a pitch, even on a professional level, I like what I read last night. Look here, gentlemen. It's like being a cowboy on the prairie. Don't worry about it. I got this. Back to you, Harp.
Yeah, when you talk about some of the greats, who do you want to take the last shot? Would that be Larry Bird or LeBron James? Would it be Bobby Layne? Back in those days, Bobby was the guy that would have the ball in his hands no matter what it was, whatever sport, and you could rest easy on his talents to help get you there. One of the neat things about the story for me is that growing up, not only through the Great Depression, but through World War II, there was a leniency on the rule that allowed for freshmen to play. They weren't allowed to up until wartime. And because there was such a scarcity of players at the NCAA level, he was allowed to play. There were some conferences that eased the rule, and the Southwest Conference was one of them. So here he is as a freshman, not only getting to be on the team and be a part of it, but he's a starter. And a difference that he made was immediate. Now TCU ends up beating Texas 7-6. There was a missed extra point. Otherwise, Texas would have been the champions of the Southwest Conference. But because there weren't a whole lot of bowl games back there, he didn't get to go after his freshman year to a bowl game. And his sophomore year was a little bit different. Back then also there was the Merchant Marines. It was a form of the military, and Bobby joined them during the off season. And he and several of the other players, not only from Texas, but all over the country, ended up doing whatever they could to serve their country while they were still in school. So he missed, 4, 5, 6 games his sophomore year before he was able to play. But Texas had already kind of proven the point that they were turning the tide and they were becoming a national powerhouse, Vincent. They play in the Cotton Bowl Classic against Missouri. They beat Missouri 40-27. And during that game, Bobby Layne ends up being accountable for every single point, whether it be through a touchdown that he threw, one that he ran, or an extra point that he kicked. Man, this guy was an amazing athlete. And obviously Texas was delighted to have him take his talents to the Austin area. He proved it early and often.
When you think about all the great players that came through the University of Texas, I'm talking about through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and me growing up in the 70s, of course, big, huge Earl Campbell fan. Then here recently, Vince Young. Then we just recently, a couple of weeks ago, we did a video on Tommy Nobis. I didn't know how great he was. I didn't know that he was really, when you look at it, the foundation, all those great players coming to the University of Texas. Bevo, the eyes of Texas. Back to you, Hawk.
Yeah, so in 46, Texas was ranked in the preseason for the first time ever. They beat Arkansas, who was number 20 in the country. They lose to Rice and then to TCU. TCU had a heck of a team right there, and so did SMU, and that's where Doak Walker went. So these two kind of, even though they were friends at the high school level, they played together. They knew each other, but they played against each other at the college level. And that's one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting. These two greats in their own manner were together, then separated, and then obviously put together again. We'll talk about that in just a second. But the career and the records that he had, multiple different records for passing, for efficiency. He's in the Cotton Bowl Hall of Fame. Just for that one game alone, there are 7 or 8 different records that he has, not only at Texas, but in the Cotton Bowl and throughout his time in the NCAA. So he had the most touchdowns responsible for in one game, and that was 6. The most points he was responsible for in a single game, and that's 40. He had the highest completion rate in that Cotton Bowl itself. He was 11 for 12. The most points scored in many different other games, not only in the conference, but in the bowl game. Most passing yards, lowest percentage of interceptions, most starts, best winning percentage, most victories, most touchdowns, record. Vincent, this guy was impressive in so many different ways, and really one of the first to do so. And in my opinion, one of those few guys that was a part of many others, don't get me wrong, he didn't do it by himself, but started to put the University of Texas on a map that they had never been on before.
When you talk about college football and you talk about down there in Austin, and as I just mentioned a few seconds ago, when you think about Texas football, the first thing people bring up is the 69 team with James Street. Then they go through the 70s with Earl Campbell. I'm bringing that up again. Then Vince Young here recently. But you just mentioned an excellent point, Hawk. Here's the gentleman that put Texas back on the map. And as you say, Hawk, it wasn't so much as his playing a bit, but he was a hell of an athlete. That's what really sticks out in my mind. Hell of a pitcher at a school that's produced so many great pitchers, Roger Clemens, a.k.a., so many great football players, Tony Nobis, a.k.a., Earl Campbell one more time, and Vince Young. But really, a lot of people don't even mention Bobby Layne. But after me doing my research on this gentleman the last 2 days, he is the eyes of Texas. Back to you, Hawk.
Yeah, well, he played well enough there to be looked at in the National Football League. Even though his baseball career, he could have easily been drafted, but he didn't want to go through the minor league system. He didn't want to have to endure the bus trips, and maybe if he's moved down from triple to double A and et cetera, all those things. Football was a portion of his excellence that other people noticed, including the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was the third selection in the 1948 draft. I want to make sure I get this right. He was offered $77,000 to play, but George Halas had also seen him. He went to the Sugar Bowl and watched him play. That year they went. They played against Alabama, and he and Bobby's wife, her name was Cherry. They had a nice conversation with George Halas, and George kind of talked him out of the draft pick. He didn't want to play with the Steelers anyways, so he ends up going with the Bears. Now the incident there was Chicago was kind of a depth chart thing. They had Sid Luckman, who was a Hall of Famer, Johnny Lujack, who was the Heisman Trophy winner from the University of Notre Dame, already on that roster, and Bobby didn't get a chance to play there. So he leaves, and then he comes back a couple years later, and this is where everything kind of goes together for him. He ends up going to Detroit, and he's with the Lions. He's reunited with Doak Walker, and in the 8 years that he was there, they win 3 NFL championships, and they were competitive all throughout. He changed the Detroit Lions, and we'll talk about the curse at the very end. There's a little known thing about that, but talk a little bit about his NFL career.
He went to Detroit, Motor City, in the 50s and changed the whole culture, changed the really face of the franchise, won 3 NFL titles, back-to-back 52 and 53 in 57. He was hurt that 57 year. Yeah. But what really sticks out to me, the battles between him and the Cleveland Browns, him going against Otto Graham. I wish I was a child back then. And most of all, he's the guy that a lot of people say invented the 2-minute drill. The 1953 championship game, 80 yards ago, under 2 minutes ago, they trailing the Cleveland Browns 16-10. A lot of people in the huddle talking. And they say, Bobby Layne say, shut up, GD. I got this. And he takes him 80 yards for the winning touchdown, 17-16. The Detroit Lions win the game. But what stuck out in my mind, he threw a 33-yard touchdown to Jim Dorn, who at the time was a backup defensive back that was in on that play. And from that point on, the Motor City started rocking. And when you look at the history of the Detroit Lions, and I didn't realize this, them and the Cleveland Browns battles during the 50s with so many great players. Graham, Motley, Paul Brown, the coach, Buddy Parker for the Lions, Bobby Layne. Man, that must have been must-see TV. Oh, you had to get down there to Detroit. But that's what I love about Bobby Layne. They said that leadership, he's probably the greatest leader that ever played on a football team. And just the honesty that he portrayed as a quarterback for the Detroit Lions is just unbelievable. And when we look at the 50s, the first thing we talk about, if you're a historian of the National Football League, everybody wants to talk about Paul Brown and Otto Graham. We need to say, back way up, and talk about the Detroit Lions. Back to you, Harp.
Yeah, the history certainly begins in Detroit, and what a difference he made. In Chicago, he has one start in the 11 games that the Bears played. The next year, he goes to the New York Bulldogs, who went defunct. They went belly up. They didn't make it. And then he was traded to Detroit for Bobby Mann was the name of the wide receiver that he was traded for. They go 6-6 his first year, and that's 1950. Next year, they go 7-4-1. And watch out, Vincent, as you say, the smoke, man, he brings it with him. In 52, they were 9-2. They were NFL champions. 53 back-to-back, 9-2 again. They win the championship. They were 6-1-1 in 1954, but they lose a playoff game. 55, they were 3-7. First bad year that he had there, and I'm sure the Detroit fans were known for their boos back then as much as they are today. But 3-7 that year. 1956, they go 9-3 again, and then they win the championship again in 1957. And 58 was the year that the Colts and the Giants played that famous game. So leading up to the league growing and expanding. Bobby was a part of the roots that helped put that together. 80, 48, and 4 was his record as a professional. Here's something that certainly wouldn't get him in the Hall of Fame today. He had 196 touchdowns and he had 243 interceptions. Those are back in the days when three things can happen when you pass. Two of them are bad. So his interception percentage was a little bit higher, but he threw for over 2,000 yards back in 1950, 2,300 yards back. That's unheard of right there. So he was setting the pace. He threw for 26,000 yards in his career, Vincent. Obviously, the numbers speak for themselves. This guy was a difference maker, and 3 championships in the 8 years that he was with Detroit. Absolutely phenomenal in terms of his ability to turn that organization around. And along with Doak Walker and Torgy Torgerson and a guy named Fum McGraw that I met, those guys were tight. They were a great group. They won together, and they were friends for life.
The mic has dropped in Detroit during the 50s. Think about what he done. I'm going to mention one more time against them great Cleveland Browns teams. And I hate to keep bringing it up, but when you talk about football history, everybody wants to talk about Paul Brown and Otto Graham, how dumb they were during the 50s. We need to back way up one more time. 52, 53, and 57, it was Bobby Layne. Probably with him and Otto Graham, it's hard to say who was the best quarterback at the time in the National Football League, but I'm going to give my vote today. I'm giving it to Bobby Layne. And I'm going to leave you with this. I was up late last night doing my research on Bobby Layne, and I remember something in a quote. It was the championship game against the Browns on their final drive. And his offensive tackle, I don't know the gentleman's name. He said, Bobby, man, you should not have been drinking, man. We smelling on your breath right now in the crucial part of the game. He said, don't worry about what I'm doing. I might be drinking on the sideline right now. What you need to get your big 8, you know what, and lead me on this drive so we can win this championship. Then I'm going to do some more drinking after the game. So that's vintage. That's royalty. That's a winner. That's a champion. That's why the best of the best play this game at a high level. Bobby Layne, in my book, is one of the tops that ever played this game. I wish I could have seen him play, and I was born at that time. Back to you, Harp.
Well, he certainly was an impression maker, and I got a chance to meet him at a golf tournament at Colorado State University. Our athletic director at that time was Fum McGraw. I mentioned him just a few moments ago. And Fum was a defensive end, about a 6'5", 235 pounder out of Colorado State. Obviously, Fum's background was from a small town in Colorado. But the way that these guys traveled back in those days, they didn't take planes, they took a train. And so a trip from Detroit to New York, let's say, or Philadelphia or to Chicago, they'd get on a train, they'd play cards together, they'd have some adult beverages, they'd relax, they'd read the paper or a magazine, but they did everything together. And it would take a day or two in some cases to get there and then to get back. So these guys were family in a different way. And if any one of them rang the phone up and says, hey, I need you, they'd all rally around. So Fum McGraw at our fundraising golf tournament invited some of his Detroit Lion teammates to attend, and they responded. So Fum had this place, it was called the Red Feather Lakes. It was a little barn that he had turned into a kind of a museum, if you will. The interior was cleaned out. He put concrete down. He had tables. He had a little bar over on the side, and you could fit 100 people in there very comfortably. And there were about 50 there when I was invited to be a part of it. And there was a little card table, room for 4. Kelly McGregor, Steve Bartello, and myself sat down at a table all by himself with Bobby Layne, and we talked for about 15 or 20 minutes. The first 10 of which was just Bobby, hey boys, how are you? And tell me a little bit about yourselves, which we didn't have anything to say. And then somebody said, Bobby, we don't know much about you. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship with our athletic director, Fum McGraw? Now, Bobby didn't mix words, right? Yeah, he had a 4-letter vocabulary, and you just had to be an adult when you're around him. But he loved Doak Walker. And Doak was in the room in a different part with his wife. I don't think Doak felt comfortable with Bobby and his language around his wife. But, gosh, they were so tight. And so getting a chance to meet a living legend, his health was deteriorating. He ends up dying in 1986. officially from a heart attack, but Bobby also had cancer. And yes, he drank a lot, Vincent, you know that. But losing your dad when you're 8 years old and being given up by your mom, having your family separated, there were certainly some things that took place in Bobby's life that he probably dealt with a little bit better with a bottle than he did with anything else. But athletically, professionally, a guy that you would want on your roster that was going to take you to the promised land. He didn't win a championship in Pittsburgh, but the last 5 years, 5.5, if you want to count that first portion in 1958 when he was traded, he's even in the Steeler Hall of Fame, right? And his numbers retired with Pittsburgh. He obviously was a difference maker with the Steelers. First year, they go 7-2. They go 6-5, 5-4. 1961, they were 2-4. They only played 6 games in the league that year, and 8 games, excuse me. And then in 62, they go 7-4. So for obvious reasons, everywhere he went, Bobby was a winner.
My final words about the legend himself, Mr. Bobby Layne, and I'm going to call him a legend today.
Yep.
Put respect on Bobby Layne's name today after you watching 100 yards of football today. Put respect on the man's name. Back to you, Harp.
He was 59 years old when he passed, and things that will never be taken away from him are the fact that he was a 3-time NFL champion. He was first-team All-Pro in the NFL in 1952 and 56. He was selected to the All-Pro second team 4 additional times, went to 6 Pro Bowls, led the National Football League in passing 2 years. He led in touchdowns, percentage. He was a scoring leader. He was a member of the All-50s All-Decade team. He's in the Pride of the Lions. He was on the 75th anniversary team for the Lions. His number 22 was retired. He's on the All-Legends teams with Pittsburgh. He's in the Ring of Honor with them. He was an All-American in college, first team All-SWAC, and that's just his football accomplishments. He has so many different ways where he would affect people in what they do athletically. He's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the College Hall of Fame. He is Bobby Layne. So we want to say thank you for tuning into our show here today. We appreciate you going back. We're turning the time back just a little bit every now and then, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s. And we want to talk about some of the great players that were part of the National Football League. So for Logan Lander, excuse me, for Jeremiah Long, our producer and engineer, for Vincent Turner, our co-host and founder, I'm Harper LaBelle saying thank you for tuning in to 100 Yards of Football. Have a great day, everybody.